You're listening to Florida Matters. I'm Matthew Petty. More than 1 million immigrants who live in Florida are here without the required documents, and that includes tens of thousands in the Tampa Bay region. They're waiting to see what President Trump's vow to begin mass deportations means for them. Coming up in about 10 minutes, you'll hear how families in the Tampa Bay region and immigrant advocates are bracing for the new administration, and what impact the promised harsh new immigration policy could have on Florida. First, though, Trump is bringing a Florida flavor to the White House as he begins his second term. The new administration is stacked with Floridians like Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Attorney General Pam Bondi. And Governor Ron DeSantis is vowing to work in lockstep with the federal government to enforce tough immigration policy. Here's DeSantis at a press conference last week.
We are going to require that law enforcement at both the municipal, county, and state level, that they have maximum participation in any programs to assist the federal government with the enforcement of federal immigration laws.
For some insights into what a Trump presidency could mean for state politics in Florida, here's Jason Delgado, Florida Capitol correspondent for Spectrum Bay News 9 and My News 13. Let me start by asking you about the special session. Now, Governor DeSantis called for the special session beginning next week. The main thing he wants lawmakers to figure out is how to enforce President Trump's immigration agenda, including a mass deportation effort. Lawmakers were a bit lukewarm on the announcement. They said it was premature and lacked detail. What exactly have the leaders of the House and Senate said, and is this session actually going to happen?
Yeah, Matt, well, look, the governor did call the special session, and he brought up a few issues that he wanted to address. But as you said, primarily this is all about immigration. So, in fact, in the last 2 weeks, he's held 2 press conferences, and they've also all exclusively addressed immigration. So here's where we're at. With Trump taking office now, DeSantis contends that Florida needs to sort of ready itself for this mass national deportation plan that, although we don't have details, we keep hearing about. And so for Florida, policy-wise, the governor wants a few things, and it's a sweeping list. For starters, he wants to appoint like a statewide immigration czar who would kind of oversee the immigration enforcement across the state. Beyond that, he kind of wants to emulate a Texas law I'm sure you're familiar with, which would empower local police to deport and to detain, and a few other things. One, he wants ID verifications for money transfers. He wanted to broaden the definition of gang activity. There's, of course, the in-state tuition. This dates back actually to 2010 under the current Lieutenant Governor Jeanette Nunez. She helped spearhead an in-state tuition discount for migrants. And that's something that the governor and many Florida Republicans want to do away with.
It's interesting you mentioned Lieutenant Governor Nunez and how she spearheaded that immigration. It really shows you the kind of 180 that I guess a lot of Republicans have done on immigration, right? Sort of seeing some of the public sentiment on that and really bending to the will of President Trump now in his second term on immigration.
Yeah, and I think it's been interesting. If you look back perhaps in the last decade, you can go back and can find a lot of popular Republican names that you're familiar with who at the time were, had kind of warmed to the idea of perhaps friendlier immigration law. And obviously, President Trump came down that escalator and brought out an agenda that we've seen Republicans really wrap their arms around.
Mm-hmm. Now, you have been reporting, as you said, on some of the subsequent press conferences that Governor DeSantis has held, kind of fleshing out a little bit the details he wants to see in this. Even if we haven't had an awful lot of detail from the president, DeSantis is kind of stepping up and saying, this is what I want. You listed some of those things, including, repealing that in-state tuition, broadening legal definition of gang activity, and voting reform. I mean, has there been anything else to kind of put some structure around some of these things that the governor is asking for? Or is it really just he's coming up with this list and this would be things that would be kind of hashed out in a special session?
Yeah, so that's how that goes. And look, I'll name one or two more. He wants a presumption that undocumented migrants are a flight risk. He also wants, in order to vote, that there would have to be some sort of affirmation of citizenship and then Florida residency. The thing is, and we heard this a lot, particularly from Randy Fine over in Brevard County in the state Senate, that when it comes to a special session, usually the policy is pre-negotiated, right? Mm-hmm. But in this case, it seems like that wasn't the case. In fact, Randy Fine was, publicly in the press asking, hey, where the heck are these bills? I've got this session coming up now in 2 weeks, and I've yet to see any policy on paper that I'm supposed to review, talk to my constituents about. And so that's been kind of the rub here between some members, including Republican leadership, is that the governor is asking for a lot, and all the while, there's no specific policy on paper for them to review. Remember, writing laws is the power of the legislature, not so much the governor.
Is DeSantis calling for any kind of crackdown on employers whose workers don't have the paperwork to be here legally?
Yeah, that's been one of the things that the governor has really championed. It's that E-Verify law. So essentially employers, with an undocumented migrant on their books could face stiff penalties. I think the governor's really championed that law. He's been very upfront and loud about it. And I think that's something we could absolutely see lawmakers take up if they choose to at the governor's behest.
DeSantis says he's been meeting with Trump's transition team. What's your sense, Jason, of the working relationship between these two? They were rivals for the GOP presidential nomination not too long ago, and pretty fierce rivals too.
Well, it looks like things are warming up, right? It's tough to say. I don't want to speculate too much, but at the end of the day, you would think, we had that Peter Hegseth confirmation, and if he fell through, well, then the idea was that, Governor DeSantis, after, they had this knife fight in the primaries, could become Trump's DOD chief. That's certainly not a small position, and it would make you think, that the two are on the mend. After all, Governor DeSantis does lead, what is essentially the leading conservative state in the country, and Trump's obviously, the kingmaker. So I think it's both at least a very important and beneficial for both of them to be, on the mend.
And just kind of back to what we're hearing from state lawmakers. I mean, you mentioned Randy Fine. He's been fairly outspoken, not just on the issue of this call for a special session, but sort of all the way leading up to this, I guess, sparring a little bit with Governor DeSantis. So is there a good kind of working rapport between DeSantis and lawmakers? And is the pushback we saw initially to this call for a special session, does that kind of tell you something about where that working relationship is between the governor and lawmakers in Tallahassee?
Well, coming off the presidential primary, there were questions about, how much influence does Governor DeSantis have left? And keep in mind, he's term limited, so he's not here for too much longer. And so that's kind of where it got interesting. Was we're kind of in uncharted waters now. At least this is the most notable time where Republican leadership has pushed back against Governor DeSantis. So the governor goes out and he makes this call for a special session in a press conference. And then it was later that afternoon, this rare moment where the Republican leadership very publicly questioned him. In a nutshell, they put out a memo and it essentially rebuked that call for a special session. And they did it with these very interesting terms. They called that special session premature. They even called it, and these are quotes, irresponsible. So I think in their words, they feel like it's immature because, again, we have yet to learn about what exactly this deportation plan looks like from President Trump, and they feel like it could do more harm than good to get out ahead of him. Not only that, Matt, there's also the question that they asked, which is why now? Session starts March 4th. And in the lead up, we have committee weeks. And so for the next several weeks, lawmakers are coming into town. They're in committees. These are all opportunities where they're already in town and could pass bills. So, what's the need to send them up on the 1 week that they're not already going to be in Tallahassee?
And just finally, Jason, the new administration does include a lot of Floridians, right? From Attorney General Pam Bondi to Secretary of State Marco Rubio and many others as well. What kind of influence is that going to have on the shape of federal government, and which Florida policies do you see kind of translating to the national stage?
Yeah, there's no doubt that, President Trump in making those picks is importing a lot of Florida influence up to D.C. And there's this saying that goes around Republican circles, and it's something like "Make America Florida." So, yes, I think to a degree we will see some sort of Florida influence. If I think of a few areas, I think of, the governor in Florida has obviously been very direct about these DEI programs. And so in Trump's agenda, you do see him, targeting DEI programs in the federal workplace. Obviously, we have immigration, but you can also think about energy policy. Education's an interesting one, too, actually. I think, Florida has aggressively expanded school choice here, perhaps more so than any state. And if Trump does indeed shut down the Department of Education, in theory, that would give states huge control over education.
Jason Delgado is the Florida Capital correspondent for Bay News 9 and My News 13. Thanks, Jason, and stay warm up there.
Thanks, Matt. I'm trying.
You're listening to Florida Matters. Coming up,
there's an expectation that there will be a chill on the community. At the same time, these families, they kind of have to keep living and keep making a living.
Hear from some of the families living under the threat of deportation in the Tampa Bay region and the broader impact of tough new immigration enforcement on Florida. This is Florida Matters. I'm Matthew Petty. Tampa Bay is home to about 80,000 immigrants who are in this country without the required documents. And with Donald Trump back in the White House, his promise of mass deportations looms large. In his first term, Trump deported more than 1.5 million people, in some cases breaking families apart. WUSF's Nancy Guan spoke with immigrants in the Tampa Bay area about how they're bracing themselves for his next term.
At a community center in Waimama, holiday festivities are in full force. Laughter and chatter fill the small room as people go around sharing their Christmas traditions from Mexico, Nicaragua, and Puerto Rico. Squeezed in the back is Bamaka, who's standing because there's not enough chairs for everyone. In this story, we're using only last names because speakers fear that they'll be targeted for their immigration status.
It's only one day in the year the family can be together.
Bamaka shares that on Christmas Eve, relatives travel from different states to celebrate with her family in Tampa. They make tamales and open gifts at midnight. But for the last 2 decades, there are loved ones that Bamaka hasn't been able to celebrate with. Her parents.
It's like 22 years or more. I don't see my dad.
Her dad lives in Mexico, and so did her mom before she passed away more than a decade ago. Bamaka hasn't returned since entering the U.S. at age 16, eventually finding a job as a seasonal farm worker. Without documentation, she doesn't have a way to travel back and forth across the border.
We talk on the phone, and we don't have FaceTime because...
They can't FaceTime because her dad lives in a rural town with little cell service, she says. They're only able to see each other's faces through photos. And when her calls do go through, it's always a relief. She switches to Spanish when explaining why.
Y siento miedo también que le pase algo a él allá, por lo mismo de los carteles.
She worries that the cartel violence in the area will one day reach her dad. He's older, in his 70s, and that makes him more vulnerable. That's the type of life she left in Mexico, she says. But with the incoming president's threat of deportations, she's now faced with the possibility of going back. Martinez, another immigrant, says that fear is nothing new in his community, especially here in Florida, which has some of the harshest immigration laws in the nation. Among them was a provision that criminalized transporting or driving undocumented individuals into the state. But that part of the law has been temporarily blocked as the U.S. District Court decides if Florida has infringed upon federal authority. Martinez says, of course they were scared at that time. He's a migrant farm worker who travels in and out of the state for work. But he thinks as long as he keeps his head down and just continues doing what he does, he'll be okay. He has to be brave for his family, he says, and tries not to talk about these things in front of his children, especially his oldest daughter, who's 13. He says she can understand what's going on and gets sad. He doesn't want her to think about what could happen. For Antonia, she worries the most about her 2 daughters. They depend on her, she says, because she's a single mother. If they send me away, who will take care of them, she asks. They need her. And Antonia argues, so does Florida. She works at a plant nursery and remembers during Trump's first term, her employers gave workers a notarized letter in case they were stopped by law enforcement. The letter was proof that they were employed at the nursery, she says, and it told police to contact the company with any issues. It's because they need us to work, Antonia says. They need our labor. Antonia, Bamaka, and Martinez are not alone. Nearly half of the state's agricultural workforce is undocumented, according to the Florida Policy Institute. But when Bamaka listens to the news, she says she doesn't hear the incoming administration acknowledge undocumented immigrants' contributions.
No somos criminales como ellos nos dicen.
She says we're not criminals like they say. But there's no telling what Trump will do, she says. To prepare, she's renewed her children's passports. Bamaka says every time she leaves home, it feels like a risk. She says she doesn't know if one day she won't return home, if a traffic stop will lead to her deportation.
Well, for more insights into how Tampa Bay's immigrant community is bracing for the next Trump administration, here's Nancy Guan. Nancy, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Matt.
So last month you told Florida Matters that DACA, which is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival recipients, you spoke to were waiting for the incoming administration with a heightened sense of anxiety about what that means for them. And in the report we just heard, you talked with agriculture workers who don't have the documentation required to be in the United States. So what stood out for you about how they think the next Trump term could affect them?
Yeah, the people I spoke with were understandably afraid and worried. Trump and his incoming administration have talked about deporting millions of immigrants who don't have legal status and making this the largest deportation effort in American history. And while there are a lot of questions about how that can be carried out, the possibility of that is scary to them. At the same time, they're trying to find a balance between being prepared and staying level-headed, I think for the sake of their families, but also for the sake of themselves and being able to continue and live and work. As you heard in the piece, Martinez, the father I spoke with, said he's been in the U.S. for many years, including during the Trump administration. So he hopes that whatever happens in his second term, he'll still be able to weather through it and still be okay. Same with Antonia and Bamaka, the other two people I spoke with. They both told me that until something happens, it's kind of draining to speculate what could happen. But as you heard, Bamaka, who has U.S.-born children, she's actually prepared her children's passports and renewed them just in case.
Yeah, and it seems like there's a real sense of limbo for some of them, right? Like Bamaka, as you said, came to the United States as a child, age 16. And as you report in the story, her father's still in Mexico, but she hasn't been back there in 20 years. So what would it be like for people in her situation getting sent back to a country that they left behind so long ago?
Well, Bamako told me that she thinks of the U.S. as more of her home more than Mexico. After all, she's been here most of her life. Her husband is here. Her children are here. Bamaka left her hometown in Mexico because of the lack of economic opportunity and cartel violence, which she described in the story. So she said she's afraid of going back and being in that situation again. And that was the case with the other families I spoke with, too. They've also been here for over 20 years. In fact, just to throw a statistic in there, most immigrants who are in the U.S. without legal authorization, most of them have been here for over 10 years, and that's according to organizations that study immigration.
Yeah. Now, we also heard from Martinez, and he talked about his 13-year-old daughter and his concerns for her if he's deported. So can you explain a little bit what the challenge is for people who live in these mixed-status families as they contemplate what may happen if they're deported?
Yes, the families that I spoke with for this story, they were all mixed status, meaning some family members are here in the U.S. legally and others aren't. In their case, they all said that their children who were born here was their biggest concern. They said that they're afraid of being separated from them, especially if their children are young and aren't necessarily able to take care of themselves yet. You heard Antonia, who has 2 young daughters. She's a single mother, so if she has to leave, she doesn't know who else will take care of them. And Tom Homan, whom Trump has appointed as his border czar, has suggested that families can be deported together, but that becomes jarring for their children who've only known the U.S. their whole lives.
Yeah, that whole notion of family separation, that was one of the sticking points, I think, for Trump's immigration policy in his first term, and something that the Biden administration sort of said, we aren't going to do this, but the comeback, as you said, from this incoming administration to say, well, if we want to keep families together, they've all got to go. But how practical is that?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the big question. I think it's been suggested, but we don't really know what else, if it's actually going to play out. I mean, when we think about the number of immigrants here without legal status, they have family members. And if all of them leave together, I mean, it would kind of leave a hole in our communities and our economy. But at the same time, there's been questions about whether or not there's enough resources to hold these families. So, yeah.
A lot of questions about that. Now, as you point out in the story, half of Florida's agricultural workers don't have paperwork to be in the United States, and they paid nearly $2 billion in taxes in 2022, which is one measure of their contribution to the economy. But what would it mean for Florida's agricultural sector if all of a sudden half the workforce is gone?
Yes, so that's according to the Florida Policy Institute. About 47% of the agricultural workforce are here without the required legal documentation. That's almost half. So if they were to suddenly disappear, it would be a huge blow to the agricultural sector and the economy as a whole. But in reality, things are more likely to play out gradually, we would say. Even then, we have to consider the chilling effect that immigration policies might have on the community and on the workforce. Some people may choose to leave the state to somewhere they think may be less hostile, or stop working because they're afraid they'll be apprehended by law enforcement on the way to work or at work. DeSantis has pointed to farm worker programs like the H-2A visa program that provides legal farm labor, but again, hiring workers through that isn't a quick process. Either way, people who work with immigrants have told me that they're anticipating some people to leave and take their families with them, which is ultimately, like they say, bad for businesses and economy in Florida.
Now, one of the people who shared their story with you, Antonia, talked about a letter from an employer explaining where they work that they could show to authorities, and that's presumably if they get swept up in an immigration sting. Did you get the sense from your interviews for this story of what help there may be from employers if their staff were facing deportation or other legal challenges?
Yeah, the letter that Antonia described was from 2017 during Trump's first term, and she said that employers gave them that in case they were stopped by law enforcement. So it was kind of a safeguard of sorts for their workers. But I'm not sure how far each employer might be willing to go when it comes to preventing deportation, especially when we're talking about the agriculture industry. Smaller growers especially rely on immigrant labor, and it'd be hard and risky for them to go against any federal directive. But I think this part of Antonia's story shows how much employers really rely on their workers and how much they do want to keep them.
Immigrant advocacy groups have told you they're holding workshops and talking with immigration attorneys. So what's going on in these workshops, and what are attorneys saying?
So some of these workshops, they're what's called Know Your Rights workshops. So that's where they discuss what rights immigrants have and what they can do if they ever encounter law enforcement or if they're possibly detained. So there's a lot of education of the immigrant community going on right now. I spoke with a local group in Waimama called the Bethel Farm Worker Ministry, which provides services to agricultural workers. They said they're getting some families who are thinking of applying for legal status or at least exploring those options. So these groups, they're providing screening opportunities for families who want to figure out if they have a pathway to citizenship, whether through asylum, temporary protected status programs, or through their U.S.-born children, for example. And these groups are also fighting against scams because during this time, there are bad actors who are using this as an opportunity to kind of prey on immigrants looking to adjust their immigration status.
So these are like people who say, I'm an attorney, I can help you out, but they're really not. They're just taking their money.
Yes, exactly. Some parents are also looking at giving guardianship over their children to other family members or community members in case they are deported. So groups are helping facilitate that legal process as well. So a lot of preparation is happening. Immigrant advocate groups, they're of course consulting with attorneys who have been around during the first Trump administration and trying to glean any knowledge from that.
And we get this from your story, but I imagine the amount of stress they must be feeling if they're having to make these plans. They're like, here's what's going to happen if I need to turn over guardianship of my kids to somebody else because I may not see them for a long time.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I can't imagine what these immigrants are feeling, but they are having to kind of make these practical decisions, whether they want to think about it or not, I think.
Mm-hmm. And as you said earlier, they're trying to sort of chart a path through this, not totally panic, like they've got to keep working and keep providing for their families, but they are facing some pretty impossible choices in some cases.
Yeah, exactly. And it kind of just depends on each family you speak with. The nonprofit member I spoke with from Bethel, she said that she's heard from families who've kind of prepared for this. There was a woman from Guatemala she spoke about who taught her children their native language, their dialect, so that they wouldn't forget it, sent them during summers to Guatemala so that they wouldn't be in a culture shock when they have to go back potentially.
Yeah. Because as you say, I mean, a lot of these folks, like, they're either born in the United States or they've come here so long ago that they don't really have much kind of connection with the country they came from.
Yeah.
So you've reported on the impact already from Florida's laws over the last couple of years targeting people in this country without the legal documents they need. Now, last week, Governor Ron DeSantis said Florida would do everything it can to uphold whatever the new administration plans to do around deportation, and he called for a special session to discuss illegal immigration, among other things, but legislative leaders pushed back. They said a special session this month would be premature. What does that kind of tell you about the appetite for some of these harsher rules around immigrants and how Florida would be, in fact, carrying out any new federal guidelines?
I think people are expecting Florida to cooperate. Just last Wednesday, Governor Ron DeSantis said that Florida will be, quote, there every step of the way when it comes to enforcing President Trump's immigration policies. And immigrants and those who work with them are on high alert because of this, and that's why they're holding these workshops and talking with their attorneys. An immigrant advocate I spoke with told me that it's a big question on how these federal policies will be implemented at the state and local levels, because federal agencies like ICE do depend on local law enforcement to cooperate when it comes to detaining people. There are these agreements called 287G agreements between local agencies and ICE that outline how local officers can carry out immigration enforcement. And based on Florida's current administration and what we've seen in recent years, they're very adamant on stopping illegal immigration.
What's your sense, Nancy, of how people you talk to for this report are going to navigate the next few months as this new administration takes office?
I think a lot of the people who can't otherwise afford to move somewhere else or don't have the resources to explore avenues of adjusting their immigration status, because that's very expensive and time-consuming, they're having to just wait and see what will happen and see what immigration policies will actually be implemented. Families are taking precautions, as I've said, and I think people are going to be more wary of driving out on the roads, or they might be hesitant to be outside in general. And just as in previous years when Florida has passed other immigration restrictions, there's an expectation that there will be a chill on the community. People are reluctant to access social services, get medical care, so people who work with immigrants are expecting more of that as well. At the same time, these families, they kind of have to keep living and keep making a living, so they'll keep doing that while watching closely to see what happens.
Nancy Guan covers immigration for WUSF, and you can find more of her reporting on WUSF.org. Nancy, thank you so much for sharing your insights. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
That's Florida Matters for this week. The executive producer is Grayson Doctor. Engineering support from Jackson Harp and Blake Bass. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and watch on YouTube. I'm Matthew Petty. Thank you for listening.